So as Kat said there, our topic is smart mobility, and our speaker is Dr. Josipa Petrunic, who's the CEO of Canadian Urban Transit Research and Innovation Consortium, which is known as QTEC, and that's what we'll call the organization in this session. So yesterday, we asked the question of what makes cities smart, and we focused on the tools of data and technology to solve urban problems. And we began to talk about what problems and what data and what technology. Smart mobility is a variation on the theme. It plays out those tools. We crafted a bit of a definition in our description, which is in the materials that you received. And it's the integration of infrastructure, technology, and vehicles driven by public sector sponsorship and private sector innovation to create transportation networks that meet transit needs of today's passengers and their communities. So one of the questions that comes out of that is who facilitates this integration process? And of course, law firms like Dentons do, but other organizations, consortiums like QTEC also do so. QTEC is pretty well unique, I think, in the Canadian market, largely at the behest of Josipa. I think of Josipa as a scholar, an academic, an entrepreneur, and a visionary. She has PhD and Master of Science in Science and Technology Studies from the University of Edinburgh. She has a Master in Political Science from London School of Economics and a BJ in Political Science at Carleton. As you'll hear, she's President and CEO of QTEC. She's built up QTEC since inception, and she'll talk to you a bit about that. Prior to that, she was lead researcher in electric vehicle policy at McMaster University. And she continues to lecture in globalization studies at McMaster University. So this session is really just about, it's about QTEC and what role it plays. And I'm going to introduce a series of topics about QTEC and ask Josipa to talk a bit about them. The first, of course, is what is a QTEC? Tell us a bit about QTEC, its background and what it does, aims to do, and a bit about its members.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. I appreciate it. And I think it's fair to say also and important to note that Dentons has helped QTEC grow over the last several years with Michael as our honorary legal counsel. We certainly wouldn't be where we are today without that support. And just in general, I mean, what is QTEC? It's a technology innovation consortium, and it is structured as a nonprofit. But I frequently say that we operate a lot more like a technology startup firm. And that's certainly, I think if you ask our staff, they certainly feel that way in terms of the go, go, go kind of nature and the entrepreneurial nature of what we do. So pretty much everything we do is technology projects. That's all that we do. And so even though transit's in the name and urban transit's in the name, we don't do general transit association business. So we don't go to government and generally advocate for transit. That's important. That happens elsewhere in the economy. What we do is design and develop technology projects for transit deployment and public sector fleet deployment in general that basically aims to get people out of their cars, get people into more mass mobility, and to make that mass mobility zero emissions, smarter, automated, connected, cyber secure, and those whole host of technological goods. So the goal is to make Canada a global leader in low carbon smart mobility, and to do that by designing the projects, the big technology demonstration projects that will put us on the map in those areas, and then to get our transit agencies to adopt those technologies and deploy them on their roads to attract foreign direct investment and to attract ridership. So that's essentially what we do. And to the extent it helps, Michael, I can explain a little bit the pillars, the 4 pillars of innovation that we work in. The first pillar is, of course, zero emissions buses. So one of our marquee projects is a pan-Canadian electric bus project in Vancouver, Brampton, and York region, where we were able to get 18 buses and 7 have overhead chargers out on the road to do for the first time in the world, to achieve for the first time in the world, interoperability and standardization of high power charging systems. That literally made Canada the leader in electric bus technology from a tech standpoint. We are also working in hydrogen within that pillar. Then the second area is in autonomous and connected shuttles, which we'll talk about a lot more here today in terms of smart mobility. Overcoming that first kilometer, last kilometer with shuttles that carry anywhere from 6 to 20 people that are automated, connected, operating on semi-dedicated or mixed traffic laneways, very tech heavy, but they support transit in delivering those services where transit cannot afford to go. The third area we work in is big data, and that's a new area for us. Most of you will be aware if you've worked with transit that there's a paucity in the data that is collected. There's not a lot of data collected, and certainly there is almost no AI associated with those data. And to the extent that it's shared, it's almost completely unshared data across cities in terms of transit. So we're looking at big data in transit, everything from Presto card data to how your buses operate and performance measures data, and not only digitizing those data, but then getting it into cloud platforms for sharing across cities. And the fifth area is cybersecurity. Insofar as we're getting people out of cars, maybe dumb gasoline cars or diesel cars, into smart enabled, automated, electrified buses on rapid transit ways. It's very cyber insecure these days. There aren't a lot of standards around cybersecurity for transit applications like that. And when you have 60 people on board a bus that's hurtling down a dedicated laneway automated at 100 kilometers an hour, you're going to want to make sure it's cybersecure. So cybersecurity is the fourth pillar that we work in. And that essentially describes what QTEC is. All we do is design projects and then try to run around the country convincing people to join those projects and convince Ottawa and the provinces to fund those projects.
So we'll go back into those pillars and talk particularly about research projects and commercialization projects. But before we get to just wheeling back a bit about QTEC and its members, there's about 100 members and there are different classifications. Can you give us a feel for who are the members? What are the classifications? Who are the members?
Absolutely. Yep. So there are, I mean, we grew from 0 to over 100 members in the last 5 years. And we've captured pretty much anybody who's, everybody who's anybody in the zero emissions, automated, connected transit world and landscape. And so our members fall into 5 broad categories. The first category is obviously transit agencies, but we don't represent all transit in Canada. You know, there's about 200 transit agencies in Canada. We represent just over 20 of them. They do capture about 80% of the ridership. So we represent a very large portion of Canadian ridership. But the transit agencies we represent that join QTEC are the ones that are keen on technology deployment. So higher risk champions of transit technology. And that could be zero emissions buses, hydrogen, automated controls, et cetera. The vast majority of transit agencies in Canada just aren't on that cutting edge or bleeding edge of technology, and that's okay. So our transit members are the ones that are trying to do something in technology and they need help to do it because they may not have a standing army that knows the technology, can research it, can deploy it, understands the commercial elements. The second category is industry members, and that's really critical. Manufacturers, tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, integrators, and then there is a new class within that of consulting firms that have joined. So the larger manufacturers are the obvious ones in this landscape. New Flyer, which makes electric buses, Nova Bus, which makes electric buses. You know, these are good Canadian-based companies, Ballard, Hydrogenics, ABB and Siemens, they're large Canadian footprints here. These are the kinds of companies that automatically join QTEC because we operate 100% in their space of growth in the zero emissions and new mobility sphere. The third category is utilities. So we are certainly the only transit-oriented technology or association that has utilities as a core component of our industry group. The larger utilities are part of our consortium, like BC Hydro, Manitoba Hydro, OPG, and then some of the local distribution companies, Toronto Hydro and Newmarket Tay Power Distribution, et cetera. A whole host of utilities that join because they are all trying to develop strategies around electrification. And most of them have thought about cars, but transit is a whole other beast when you electrify these kinds of heavy duty fleets. So we have utilities and they join because they do not have expertise in the transit electrification or heavy duty electrification electrification zone. The fourth membership category is academics. So we represent a host of universities and colleges and CEGEPs across the country, where sometimes the research we need to do to help our industry members is more academic-y, policy-oriented. And so we'll bring in the researchers at the universities to support that. And then the fifth group is, of course, government and nonprofits that are part of the championship ecosystem, the cheerleading squad, I like to say, that cheers us on across their networks, or when it comes to government, are the folks that we go to get money to actually deploy all this stuff.
So there's a couple of areas that I'd like to talk about, major research projects, but I'd like to leave that to last because I want to be sure that we have enough time to talk about commercialization projects, and in particular the smart vehicles and smart infrastructure pillar that you mentioned before. Can you talk to us a bit about that?
Yeah, so one of our major projects is our National Smart Vehicle Project, and it started about 4 years ago, like all of our projects, where we were selling a vision that nobody wanted to adopt, and for good reason, because it's technologically complicated. The vision in the Smart Vehicle Project was, look, there's a bunch of manufacturers out there, and at that time there were quite a few, Navia, Easy Mile, To Get There, Local Motors, a number of them, Arugo, and they're still around, and they were offering autonomous smart shuttles. So basically driverless mini buses that were electrified, they're all electrified, on the basis that these little pods would start at a rail station or a bus station and be able to transport people to their home. And a lot of the companies were starting off on the idea that these things could be deployed for public transit, but probably they should be deployed privately through on-demand services, a kind of aggregated shuttle competitor to Uber or Lyft that would be cheaper than Uber or Lyft. More, you'd have to have other people on board with you, but could be deployed more rapidly through a systemic fleet pattern. Increasingly over the last couple of years, it's become obvious that the real application there is for transit and transit-oriented deployments of those shuttles. So that's good. But the problem is when we started the project, we had one technology goal, and that was standardization. These shuttles do not talk to each other. So if you are a transit organization, an agency, or a city looking to procure 20 shuttles that could go from Billy Bishop Airport and be deployed out to those communities that are not easily connected by subway, streetcar, or bus, but are within, say, a 5-kilometer zone of Billy Bishop Airport or Union Station, there was no way that you could buy a standardized technology. You basically were throwing a dart in the dark and guessing at what you should buy, what kind of technology on board, what kind of roadside units you should buy. And goodness forbid you went ahead and bought some of those, you would have to deal with the fact that a year later, if you wanted to ramp it up and add more shuttles and you bought from another manufacturer, the two things would not talk to each other. So those shuttles from multiple manufacturers would compete and be proprietary and not be able to communicate with each other safely on the same routes. That doesn't work for any city because it means you're locked into monopolies. So our project started off with the idea of, could we get Easy Mile and Navia and To Get There and Arugo to standardize their vehicle-to-vehicle communications, their vehicle-to-infrastructure communications, and eventually their vehicle-to-everything communications. But V2V and V2I are the most important for autonomous shuttles that are going to deliver first kilometer, last kilometer solutions. When we started the project, most manufacturers said no. There's no chance we're going to standardize because exactly like in the electric bus domain, lots of sales were happening in early pilots with proprietary technology. Fast forward a couple years in, there's no mass procurement of driverless shuttles. And that is because the early pilots proved out there's a lot of tech that has to be improved and the things don't talk to each other. So our project right now has renewed life. We have about 6 cities that have put up their hands and said, look, we did a small shuttle pilot. It went nowhere. We didn't procure anything off it. It was nice and sexy and cool. But for us to actually go do a procurement and attach it to our buses and streetcars as first kilometer, last kilometer, we need standardized, interoperable V2V and V2I communications. And we do now have manufacturers saying, okay, in exchange for a large procurement and maybe a joint procurement, we'd be willing to redesign our systems to be standardized. So that is what the project is, what we're working on. Challengingly for Canadians, we don't make these shuttles in Canada, so they are all foreign goods, but we do design the driverless systems, the automated systems, some of the connected systems, and some of the roadside systems. So there are jobs within it.
So let's move on to something still in the commercialization space, and that's zero emission buses. You can't avoid the news that comes out daily about the billions of dollars that's being poured into zero emission buses by the federal government, by provincial governments. You've been working this space now for 4 years. Can you tell us a bit about what you've been doing and for what, with what goals?
Sure. So when we first started in this space 5 years ago, again, we had a technology goal, which was electric buses were proprietary. So if you bought a BYD bus, it plugged into a BYD charging system. You bought a New Flyer bus, it plugged into a New Flyer charging system. You bought a Nova bus, it plugged into a Nova bus charging system. There is no city in the world that wants proprietary bus solutions that cost millions and millions and millions of dollars, that they're locked into monopolies. So we started on a technology demonstration project, as I mentioned, in Vancouver, Brampton, New York region, to get manufacturers to standardize their buses. And thankfully, New Flyer Nova bus, along with ABB and Siemens, came forward and said, you know what, with a certain amount of volume, it makes sense for us to standardize. And we know that's where the industry has to go. So New Flyer Nova bus redesigned their vehicles to plug into high power overhead charging systems that ABB and Siemens redesigned, all to an interoperability protocol called the OpCharge protocol, which Volvo Group had by that time published in Europe. That protocol has now been deployed in those 3 cities, and we're proving it out. And it's hard and it's difficult because something standardized on paper doesn't actually mean it works perfectly in real life. That's why it's a demonstration project, to figure out all those pain points on the engineering side. But it has helped the publication of something called J3105, which is the Society of Automotive Engineers standard for North American high power charging. So we can take credit, and I certainly do at QTEC, that our members push for the world's first interoperability trial, showing that interoperability is possible, standardization is possible, and manufacturers based in Canada deployed the tech and are now selling that technology as the current standard technology. But that wasn't enough. A deployment and a demonstration project are not enough to get 200 transit agencies in Canada to buy zero emissions buses. And at the federal level, of course, our federal colleagues are frustrated as to why money is going out the door for infrastructure. And we all sing the songs of green infrastructure, but it seems like almost nobody is buying electric buses, and absolutely nobody is buying hydrogen fuel cell buses. And the question is why? Why in a country with 15,000 buses are there only about 120 electric buses on the road right now, most of which are in Edmonton, Toronto, and Vancouver, or Edmonton, Toronto, and Montreal? And the answer is, in general, that there was a missing part of the puzzle, and that was the feasibility studies, the physics and the mathematics and the economics that models out how will these electric buses and fuel cell buses operate in your environment, in your fleet, how much energy will you need, how much charging time, how many kilograms of hydrogen before your bus runs out of power and cannot deliver the service. And that was not thought of as critical 3-4 years ago, that feasibility work. And that's where QTEC started developing in-house a tool we call Route I, which now has become Canada's most successful modeling tool in modeling out precisely and predicting precisely for agencies, how many electric buses do you need, what battery capacity, how much charging power, how many kilograms of hydrogen, when do the charging episodes have to happen, and what power level and cost factor associated with all that stuff. That feasibility work really should have happened 4 or 5 years ago. Nobody was thinking about that, though, 4 or 5 years ago, because in the world of diesel, you can get away with wastefulness. It's possible to rev an engine going up a hill and burn through a lot of molecules of diesel, even as a transit agency, because it's so cheap. You just don't feel it fundamentally, and because your bus will not run out of power before it returns to the depot. In the electrified world and hydrogen world, you will run out of power if you waste your electrons. That will happen. Or you will face bills that are astronomical and you will not end up with the savings over diesel you predicted. So you have to be extremely precise about the use of your energy, which is just something transit never had to do. So where we are today, Canada's not last in the pack, but we're not first in the pack in electrification of transit. And we should be, because we are the basis for most of the manufactured products, the Nova buses, the New Flyers, the Ballard fuel cell stacks. These are Canadian manufactured and designed goods. It's our industry to lose. Our transit environment is slow to pick it up because nobody has funded their feasibility studies. And so this is the big pain point. And what we've said is, before you spend billions of dollars on green infrastructure at the federal level, which you should do, make sure that it's tethered to cities coming to the table with feasibility studies, like what we do with our Route I tool.
So one of the pillars which I find really intriguing is the big data for mobility and analytics and mobility as a service applications. And this is, my perception is that it's just coming over the horizon for QTEC. Can you talk about what you have in mind there?
Yeah, so I mean, mobility as a service is really based on the idea that I should be able to demand a service at any point in time and be a, snobby middle-class transit rider as I am, and expect a brilliant customer service to arrive at my door and take me to wherever I need to go cheaper than an Uber could do. Right. That's ultimately the idea, is that things are on demand, that they're usually, the assumption is they're electrified, and that they're integrated with a wider mass mobility network that takes me from wherever I am to the hub that's going to move me in a mass mobility form, like rail or bus or coach. That is coming around the corner. There is a lot of hype around this, just like there was a lot of hype around electric buses and then fuel cell technology and then autonomous driving technology. There's a lot of hype around mass. Mass is a great area where we could really reduce costs, especially for people in cities, and eliminate the need for cars. There's no doubt about that. But there is a fight, there's a battle underway already, and it's going to become nasty, I think, in the next couple of years. Minus COVID, it would have already gotten a little bit nastier. The battle is who should deliver these services. Should this be primarily delivered through private fleets like Uber and Lyft that are already delivering technically on-demand mass mobility? But they're not communicating to each other, and they don't have a public sector obligation, and they're not necessarily tied in an optimized way to the buses and the coaches and the streetcars and the trains. Should we just let the private sector deliver it and hope that the marketplace, being people, individual users who are not coordinated with each other, somehow drive it to the most efficient network deployment? The answer to that at QTEC is no. Do we instead take option 2, which is work with transit agencies like TTC and TransLink and Brampton Transit to say, right now, we need to start thinking about deploying on-demand services, which means the software platforms that give your transit riders a lot more power over you than they've ever had before. And that is just at the nascent starting point. Similar to autonomous vehicles and shuttles, a lot of our transit agency members are keen on the idea of mass mobility, or mass mobility as a service rather, but not sure how to deploy it. And most of the lobby work has come from the private fleet providers like the Lyfts and the Ubers offering that service. There is right now nobody who offers on-demand shared mobility shuttles that theoretically could be driverless or have drivers that are operated and deployed through a software platform that integrates with buses, streetcars, and trains. That's not happening. So it's a big gap. Therefore, I would say it's a space where we will start to play, but I'm cognizant of the serious challenges. It is still a problem in Ontario to get Presto data from Metrolinx to be shared back to the transit agencies that need those data to know when to reschedule their buses to show up at your Metrolink station on the GO train. That basic level of data sharing does not exist today effectively after decades of Presto being developed. So us developing really optimize mass services in Canada is going to take some time. We have a big data sharing, data collection, and data analysis gap in our transit industry in general.
So clearly a public sector player like Metrolinx is pivotal to any mobility as a service paradigm. But just stepping back a bit, can you describe what mobility as a service is? Just describe a scenario as to how that works.
Yep. So maybe we'll use a case study because in general, philosophically, mobility as a service is that mobility through any mode, whether it's a car, a shuttle, a bicycle, a train, a streetcar, or a bus, should be something that is tracked. So I know what mobility mode I have available to me as a user and where it is at a given point in time. And I should be able to demand it or request it at a time that suits my schedule, not the Central Transit Authority's schedule. So mobility as a service is essentially seeing mobility not as buses or assets, but rather as a service. And so therefore TTC would not be the operator of buses and subways, but the deliverer of a mobility service that gets you from point A to point B, regardless of what platform we put you in, a car, a scooter, a skateboard, a bike. They're delivering to you a whole series of services that you can access in real time. So that's great. That all sounds fantastic. What would an example look like? An example would look like me here in Canary District in downtown Toronto, where I am. I'm pretty well connected to transit. I have streetcars and I have a subway not too far away and I have buses all over the place. However, there are points in the day, and in particular during COVID, but there are points in the day where that streetcar is not coming around the corner, where the bus is very slow on fixed route scheduling, and I have to get to Union Station or to Billy Bishop Airport. And the only other way for me to get there in the time frame that I have is to call an Uber or call a taxi. Mobility as a service would allow me to punch in on my phone. Essentially, I need to get from where I am right now to Billy Bishop, and the fixed route service that TTC offers is not going to get me there. But I want to use a public service. If TTC were operating mobility as a service, I would get recommended to me a whole host of options, like an Uber that is subsidized possibly or tied into the transit service as a shuttle service to Billy Bishop, or as a shuttle to my streetcar that gets me to Billy Bishop. That on-demand service would require the integration fundamentally of those private fleets with the public sector requirement at the core. That's just one example. So usually the bigger examples that people use are out in the suburbs, trying to get from suburbia, where there's no real fixed route schedule that accommodates anybody at any time, and trying to get them to rail hubs or transit hubs. Well, there I should be able to on demand request any kind of mobility mode, and the local transit agency should be able to tell me, you know what, taking a bicycle is going to be your fastest mechanism, and the bicycle is just around the corner from you, or your electric scooter is 200 meters down the street. You should go catch that.
Yeah, I mean, the examples that I really like, and it works better in a pre-COVID or post-COVID world, is somebody wakes up in their home in Montreal and has to get to a meeting in Etobicoke in Toronto. And so the demand service is an Uber to pick them up in Montreal to bring them to the airport, an airline to bring them to an airport in Toronto, another Uber to bring them from the airport to wherever they're going in Etobicoke, and they buy one ticket, and the scheduling is all interactive. So if there's a delay, then the schedule changes. The program buys new tickets and informs the user. So in theory, this is the kind of program that, using all of this data, all of this interconnectivity, all of the players that are pivotal in all of this, to bring a unified on-demand service to citizens in the country to go virtually anywhere.
Yeah, and that's often been labeled as, you know, one ticket for all modes, right? I shouldn't have to buy a whole bunch of different tickets. I don't like that example though, Michael, because it uses a lot of cars and airplanes. How about it would connect me to the subway in Montreal that gets me to the Via line, that gets me to the coach bus service, that gets me to Burlington or wherever. But, you know, you can add to that the fact that it wouldn't just be the one ticketing. It would also be that maybe I get points across that too. You know, I'm somehow benefited as the user, the client of the service, and I get on a bus here and a train there and a coach here and a streetcar and a scooter there, and somehow I get recognition across that entire trip, which is just not possible right now because it's all desegregated.
So Josipa, that's been great. It's been a really good discussion. As you know, I'm a great fan of QTEC, and I think it does wonderful things and will continue to do wonderful things, and under your leadership it's become magic. So thanks for doing this for us today.
Thank you for those kind words, Michael, and I really appreciate all the support you've provided over the years. Thank you so much to your audience.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Josipa. We do have a few questions for you if you're able to stay on for a moment.
Sure.
I wondered, in your work, that we have a question with respect to whether in your work you have seen examples outside of Canada that we can learn or borrow from. What would those examples be? Which municipalities are sort of ahead of us in this space?
Yeah, so I guess is the question more on the smart vehicle side and the mobility as a service, or on the electric busing side? Because they're two very different domains, and maybe I'll give an example of each. Sure. So on the electric busing side, and when we say electric buses, we mean both battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric buses. In North America, there's no doubt that most Californian jurisdictions are moving ahead much more rapidly than we are. Having said that, doesn't mean that the cities are all moving ahead gracefully. A lot of them are moving ahead kicking and screaming. But the reason that they're moving ahead with the procurement, the deployment, the testing of the electric bus technologies, even when things are going wrong sometimes, is because the state set state level regulations and obligations that have punitive implications. So it's a forceful top-down approach in California. It has driven the market. Some would argue the better approach has been in Europe, where the European Union has set targets that are not as harsh as California, but has also funded and organized joint procurements for technology projects. context. And that's where you're seeing a whole bunch of large joint procurements for electric buses and hydrogen buses and all the newest technology being integrated. So I would say across the European Union, there are multiple cities from London to Amsterdam, that Vienna, that are deploying the newest technologies in electric busing, but they were supported as cities through a European Union-wide set of regulations that were buttressed by funds for those technology procurements. We don't have that in Canada, and California doesn't have that. So it's a little bit more ad hoc in fits and spurts. On the autonomous vehicle side, definitely the shuttles have been more frequently and repetitively deployed in Europe than they have been in North America in pilot mode. And so in pilot mode, there's definitely more one-off shuttles or small fleet shuttle deployments like in Paris and in Amsterdam, where there's been a lot of revenue kilometers of experience in a driverless autonomous shuttles, some of which have been connected to on-demand services, so a mobility as a service platform. There, I would say European Union cities are further ahead than North American cities where we're still in the pilot mode. We're doing 1 or 2 short little driverless shuttle pilots for about 4 or 6 weeks, and then we shut it down and we don't do anything with it. In terms of mobility as a service, though, the jury is out on that one. There's been quite a few trials. I mean, folks are familiar in Innisfail with the trial with Uber, where there, you know, the trial of an on-demand shuttle, on-demand service. Was that successful? Was it not? Well, people used it and it burned through some cash and there were some kilometers generated. Is it a sustainable model? Jury is out on that one. Depends where you fall on that side of the divide. But there are quite a few pilot projects that have resulted in some meaningful mobility as a service efforts in Los Angeles in particular, and some of the larger cities in the US. Again, however, I would say most of the platforms we're seeing that are the most advanced mobility as a service are coming out of Europe. And that's not surprising because it's being frequently deployed in cities where people are using it as an integrated mode to get on buses and subways and interregional trains. And so it's not surprising that where you have, you know, even look at ridership on rail, 80% of rail in Europe is passenger, not freight. It's not surprising that mobility as a service platforms are being trialed out there more frequently than here.
So we've been granted a bit more time. Josipa, do you have 5 or 10 more minutes?
I do.
Okay. So one of the things that I just wanted to touch on, just because it is and has been a big part of the QTEC world, is research projects. And can you describe the how that works and what kinds of projects you've been engaged in over the last 3 or 4 years?
Yeah, so we have, I mean, obviously we have our big commercialization projects, and then we have research projects we do that are on the commercial side, the RUDI feasibility modeling work we do where cities or transit agencies are coming to us saying, look, we need somebody to very quickly map out the physics of how electric buses and fuel cell buses will work in our community, or autonomous shuttles, how many people they'll move, what the cost is, what the electricity bill will be. So we do that internally at QTEC. We push that out. We do that frequently through sole source contracts. And I have a very, you know, now half of my team is a research team of physicists and engineers and so on to do just that. And increasingly, we're going into RFPs with partner companies like AECOM or HDR and so on to do that kind of work. Then we have another program that we got funded by the Ontario government a few years ago. It was a $10 million fund that the Ontario government at that time granted to us to deploy, where we support industry academic projects. And this is where the industry member comes forward and says, I want to design XYZ. It's really expensive and we don't have all the cash. But if the taxpayer offset it a little bit, we would invest that cash in Ontario and we develop that intellectual property with one of your university partners. So we have over a dozen projects like that. And one of the most recent ones is with eCamion, one of our member companies. It's a small to mid-sized business out in Scarborough. They design and develop energy storage systems. Well, there are really big players in energy storage: Siemens, ABB, Bosch, Eaton. These are really large industrial players that develop big box batteries and storage devices for large scale utility deployments. In the last few years, they've started to redesign them to be smaller and more nimbler and less ugly so that they can fit in communities where they're attached to a bunch of charging systems or a transit garage without the ugliness of the hum of a big electrical piece of equipment. But it's still big box and they're large players and there's a large cost to those things. And so some companies like eCamion have come up saying, hey, we can design these things a lot more nimbler with a better design with a way lower cost. And so one of the projects we just recently funded at about $1 million out of that $10 million pot was with eCamion, working with a series of universities and colleges in Ontario, where they are now designing a new mechanism for half the price of what it costs currently for an overhead charger and storage device. And mind you, an overhead charger is $1 million. So that means cutting the cost brings it down to 500,000. And given that an agency might need dozens and dozens of these, this is millions of dollars saved. And eCamion is designing that overhead charging equipment to connect with storage device in half the cost. And they're using universities to design that intellectual property right now. So those are some of the kinds of projects we have funded through that $10 million pot. Sadly, that program was canceled last year just by cost-cutting measures in Ontario. And we're back asking Minister Fedeli and other ministers saying, you really need to refund it.
It's more money.
More money. I mean, this thing created a lot of jobs, hundreds of jobs already. It's a great program.
That's great, Josipa. So I think we're lined up for our next speaker. So thank you again.
Perfect. Thanks so much.